there may have been tampering of EWL software, and that the numbers reported to central office differed from the real numbers of veterans waiting. How is it that the EWL appointments could be overwritten to zero out previous appointments? And do you believe audit controls were deliberately disabled?
Yes, I think there was one of two methodologies used. Either they had two lists, one of which was reporting a number of 100 or 200, which the IG's graph showed that it was a small number and not correct, and they had a second list where they disabled the reporting function, or they went in and tampered with the reporting software so that it would not give an accurate number of, say, over 200. Certainly the IG's data shows that from the inception of that list, it never gave the right number. Dr. During had said that the time this broke out that the waiting list time was 55 days. Well, on the actual non-reporting electronic waiting list, there were 14 to 1,600, and the wait was 6 months. If you threw in the 3,500 that were scattered around on the scheduled appointment consults on loose papers, the wait was probably more on somewhere between 1.5 to 2 years. But I know I've reported this to the IG. I've also reported this to the FBI, and I know they're taking a look into it, and hopefully they will be able to find the forensic computer evidence to support that claim.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Griffin. The language that was included in the OIG final report regarding the conclusive case of death has no relation at all to any accepted standard of measure in medicine. As a matter of common sense, if VA doesn't schedule appointments early enough to treat a disease, it is highly likely that veterans with potentially fatal conditions will needlessly suffer from conditions and possibly die. The question, does that make sense to you, and do you agree with that statement?
So I agree with your statement. The premise is that if your care is delayed, then you're very likely going to be harmed. And when we started this review, it seemed to me that would be what we would find over and over and over again. And we looked at these cases and we didn't find that. So we said, well, why didn't we find that? And I think there are two of Dr. Foote's cases in here where, in fact, he can go home and say he saved a life. He found a patient that was in a waiting list or in a pile who had diabetes and another one that had critical heart care, and he intervened to make sure that they lived. It's also clear that veterans have access to other emergency rooms and other sources of care beyond the VA. So in retrospect, thinking about this question, I think that people must have been extremely diligent at Phoenix, where they knew the trains didn't run on time, to try to make sure that vulnerable people got care. I can only report the news. This is what I found.
Okay, let me ask you this. Was this measure applied when the OIG reported that veterans died while waiting for care in South Carolina and Georgia?
Again, I'll say that I normally go to the point where we determine that poor quality of care was provided. So
can you answer that question?
I'm sorry?
Was this same measure applied when the OIG reported that veterans died while waiting for care in South Carolina or Georgia? What is your answer to that question?
So it's usually a fact-based, it's usually a fact pattern-based decision on exactly what happened. I'm not sure exactly which report you're referring to, so it's usually, in each report, it's usually a different fact pattern. If we determine that poor quality of care was provided, then we try to look at systemic issues and try to get VA to do the right thing with respect to quality of care.
So the report discussing the delay in colonoscopies in those...
Oh, the Columbia? States. Okay, yes, sir.
Can you answer that question? Was the same standard applied?
In the Columbia case, it was our...
particular report.
I don't think, the same standard wasn't applied because the fact pattern was entirely different. In Columbia, VA had found that they had delayed colonoscopies in a large population of veterans, and as a result, as you would expect, a large number of veterans developed colon cancer that probably would have been prevented had the colonoscopy had been done. And VA admitted that some of those patients had died, and VA had already undertaken the process to notify those patients. What my report was looking at was, why did this happen? How is this possible? And what we determined was that VA does not have a way to ensure that nurses in clinics that need, if a nurse leaves a clinic, and that job is critical to the performance of that clinic, refilling that position is given to a board within the hospital where administrators decide whether or not they're going to fill the nurse position or a teaching position or a research position. So again, we focused on what can VA do to make sure this doesn't happen. And so, yes, the same standard wasn't applied because the fact patterns were quite different.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.